Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Oh, I love it. Good energy today. Well, thank you guys for being here today. Thank you for joining us to celebrate Constitution Day. And thank you guys for being here to celebrate as we engage in this wonderful conversation. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is named after Alexis de Tocqueville. Born of the French aristocracy, Tocqueville examined the world to understand democracy. His investigations convinced him that liberal ideas, which rejected both the antiquity of an aristocracy and doubted the promises of the French Revolution, were the progression of history, whether individuals fought for or against these ideals. He was convinced that equality of conditions was a providential fact. This lecture series invites scholars, professionals, and civic leaders to present on the ideas of liberty and equality as they relate to other concepts important in the founding and continuation of American government. Hosted on the campus of Jacksonville State University, these free lectures are open to the public. They welcome the campus, community, and country to listen, think, reflect, and engage with each other. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is funded by generous grants from the Jack Miller Center and Alabama Humanities Alliance. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advancing education in America's history, its political and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions, which continue to animate our national life. The Alabama Humanities Alliance exists to provide context, build empathy, and make the state of Alabama a more vibrant place to live, all through the humanities. In addition, today's event is a partnership with the American Democracy Project at Jacksonville State University. This is a nonpartisan initiative to prepare students for life through the development of civic skills, knowledge of the structures and processes of democracies, and engagement with their communities. This committee is a proud co-sponsor of today's event and is hosting a free speech forum on Tuesday, October 3rd at 6 p.m. in the Houston Cole Library on the campus of Jacksonville State University. It's my pleasure today to introduce our two short lecturers, and we'll have a conversation following that and then open up for Q&A. Dr. Paul Carrese is the founding director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Unlike aristocratic founders, I hear Dr. Carrese is beginning a peaceful transition of power, and we, the public, are in anticipation to see what private life has in store for him next, as he has a long list of accomplishments that he plans to grow on. He's a renowned scholar on Montesquieu. He also has impressive publications within American political thought on topics such as statesmanship, moderation, and judicial activism. While at the U.S. Air Force Academy, he co-founded an honors program that blended liberal arts education with leadership education. Who knew? I mean, maybe Xenophon knew, but who knew you could do such a thing? He serves on the founding advisory board for the program of public discourse at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And he's a co-leader of the Educating for American Democracy initiative with others, including our second lecturer. Dr. Jane Kamensky is a professor of American history at Harvard University. Unlike her peer, I hear she's in the business of founding at the moment, as she's peacefully collaborating with others to protect academic freedom within higher education. She's a prolific researcher with interest in histories of family, culture, and everyday life in America. Her books engage with topics including political speech in early New England, America's first bank collapse, famous paintings, and if you're not familiar with Copley, it's a fantastic work, and an upcoming work on the sexual revolution. Dr. Kamensky performs numerous services, such as serving on the Council of Advisors for the Women's Suffrage National Monument Foundation and being on the advisory board for the Gates Ventures Open Education Resource Project. In addition, she has received numerous honors for her work, including the Public Scholars Award from the National Endowment for Humanities and a Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship, and being a co-leader of the Education for the American Democracy Initiative. Please join me today in welcoming our guest to Jacksonville State University.
So is the floor mine now?
Jane doesn't have to worry. I've agreed to turn over power at my department, so I will agree after 10 minutes to turn the floor to Jane. So I'm going to turn a little bit so I can see the folks over on this side of the room. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Ben, for inviting other people who collaborated and supported this to celebrate Constitution Day. It's a particular honor and pleasure to be here with Jane Kamensky. We're going to have a throwdown later. I'll be more hostile and aggressive then, but it really is an honor to be speaking with Jane, and you'll discover why. A highlight of my whole academic life has been to be involved with this Educating for American Democracy study that Ben mentioned on K-12 civics and history education as a collaborative effort. So we had agreed to talk about freedom of speech in relation to the Constitution as a way to celebrate Constitution Day as a civic education enterprise, this important principle, which is quite controversial now on university and college campuses in public school settings and beyond. The view that certain kinds of speech are hateful and hate speech, and therefore they're kind of violence. People in an academic community, students, faculty, staff might feel unsafe, they might feel harmed, they might feel excluded if certain ideas or certain speakers are present and I'll just confine it to a university setting. So we thought this would be a way to celebrate knowledge of the Constitution, and I'll go a step further, appreciation, patriotic appreciation for the Constitution by talking about this important idea. My premise is that our entire constitutional political order presumes a principle of freedom of speech. Every important thing that's ever happened in American politics, you could date it at least to the 1760s and 1770s, but you could go back earlier to the forms of freedom and government in the 17th century in America. It all presumes, participates in, practices by necessity, freedom of speech and debate. The Constitution itself arises from debate in the Constitutional Convention in private, but then in the ratification debate. So that's my thesis for you, and then I have three more particular points. Even if the principle of speech is found in an amendment, most emphatically, this is a fundamental premise or pillar of our whole constitutional order. So why is that the case? What can we learn about it today? What should Americans always be learning about it, but learn about it today, in particular, given this controversy over freedom of speech? And it's therefore fitting that we're in a sort of dialogue format today, right? Exchanging speech. Okay, with that opening, just give me, like, when I've used up I must have only 8 minutes left. So my first thought for you is that the Constitution is worthy of study. I'm the head of an academic department at Arizona State University on civic thought and leadership. One of the first things we did was develop our own pocket Constitution, and we give it out at all of our public events. In the spirit of American constitutionalism and federalism, we have an Arizona pocket Constitution as well. We were told we were the first entity in the whole state of Arizona. Arizona's only been around as a state since 1912. So we have both pocket constitutions. The Constitution is worthy of study. Every American citizen, every aspiring American citizen, especially, let me say, if you disagree with it, if you find it imperfect. I mean, the Constitution has a principle of adaptation or coping with imperfection in it, the amendment principle. But if you disagree with it, you ought to study it first and say, on the basis of study, here's what's wrong with it. So my first principle, study the Constitution. And if you study the principles of the Constitution, you'll see fairly quickly how this principle of freedom of speech is implicit, even if it's only explicit in that one amendment and in one prior phrase of the Constitution. And my argument here is that if we use a metaphor for our era of hardware and software, right? We might be familiar with the hardware of the Constitution, that it is a federal constitution for a union, and there are states, structural principle, states and union, and there's separation of powers, right? These structural hardware elements require a software to run through them. And if you've got any of you are, Mac people, if you run PC software through a Mac, things are not going to operate the correct way. Now, we're more than a machine, right? We are citizens of a free constitutional republic. The software is our civic virtues and our civic knowledge. So to study the Constitution, we owe it, being free human beings, free citizens, we owe it to have at least the minimum civic knowledge and the minimum set of civic virtues that we need to operate this complicated constitutional republic. And then in all the 50 states and territories and such, right, to be a citizen of the state of Alabama, what civic knowledge and civic virtues do I need, do we need? So that's my first point. Study to develop civic knowledge and civic virtues. And then I want to say something more specifically about the kind of civic knowledge needed. And I'll say something about civic virtues, and then I'll close with a thought about what this means about free speech and controversies on campuses today. The separation of powers, as I said, presumes speech. There are negative reasons we all think about the separation of powers, right? To prevent tyranny, prevent too much power being in any one branch of government. So you disperse and distribute the power. There are positive reasons for distribution of powers, from especially this French philosopher Montesquieu, from the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists who agreed with the principle of separation of powers. They just thought it was a hack job that was done in the Constitution, right? It was done badly. Federalism itself is a distribution of power principle, right? That's not only for negative reasons. So there are positive reasons for the distribution or separation of powers, as well as the negative. And one of the most positive of principles is the more we have to argue, the less dumb we are, and the smarter we are. If a law has to take, we were talking about, Schoolhouse Rock, right? I'm just a bill. I'm Capitol, right? You learn about, well, a bill has to, starts in one branch or the other, and it has to go to the other house of Congress, and the president, he can veto it, right? All of that is not just to prevent tyranny, it's to make the law produced in the end better than it would have been. How is that going to happen? Speech, argument. That's the first prefigurement of speech in the Constitution. I was just looking it up, at the end of Article 1, Section 6. No member of either House of Congress can be questioned for anything they said in the Houses of Congress. It's to protect their freedom of speech and deliberation in the Houses of Congress. So before the First Amendment, right? So that's a positive reason. And there's the implicit principle. Oh, free speech, deliberation, debate, argument. It doesn't say safe speech. It doesn't say non-hateful speech, as if who would be the judge of what's hateful and non-hateful speech. The state constitutions were protecting freedom of speech as a sort of classic English common law right before the federal constitution. And that's one of the immediate arguments the Anti-Federalists made. Wait a minute. Our state constitutions have it. The Vermont Constitution, I was an undergraduate student in Vermont, begins with a Bill of Rights before it ever gets to the powers of structures of government, right? So it was a kind of obvious argument that self-government, which arises out of each particular colony and then state, they're protecting freedom of speech. They see the software hardware principle, so to speak. The Federalists, in effect, have to admit fairly quickly, okay, yeah, we should have had some of these amendments of classic common law rights. And James Madison is the sponsor of it in the House of Representatives. And as I already mentioned, the dialogue, debate, deliberation of the ratification debate, state by state, and the printed evidence we have of that, the Anti-Federalist writings, and then the Federalists, right? Freedom of speech in practice by framers and founders. The civic virtues part of studying the Constitution. Freedom of speech requires an understanding that you won't be demagogic and demonizing and violent primarily in your speech, right? The software requires that our speech is primarily, to the best we can, about reasons and evidence and argument, and not the Latin phrase ad hominem, and not demonizing your opponents, right? I'm center right in my political and intellectual views. Jane is probably center left in her political views, although she's becoming increasingly conservative in her academic views, I think. She's getting smarter as she grows older. Right. But I'm not supposed to say, oh, this, left-wing Marxist Harvard professor, and then I say what I think about Jane's views, right? And she's not supposed to trash me as some right-wing nut, and then she says what she thinks about me, right? To force self-government, we want to put the emphasis on and try and hold ourselves to the view that we are reasonable in our disagreements, and we focus on the subject matter and the content. So one reason both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists write with pen names, right? Cato, Brutus, Federal Farmer, etc. on the Anti-Federalist side. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay choose Publius, a Roman statesman, was not so much to protect themselves from being doxxed on the internet. It was to put the emphasis on, it doesn't matter that I'm James Madison from Virginia, or I'm Alexander Hamilton, or I'm whoever the Anti-Federalists are. It's to put the focus on the ideas, right? Not on personalities and parties. So I'll just quickly mention 3 of the civic virtues that we seem to have lost, and I will finger my own discipline. Political science used to know about these ideas. They used to teach it. We've totally forgotten it. The first of them is why would you have civic virtues as a citizen? Well, you have to be a patriot. Grateful for, proud of being a citizen of this political community. Alabama as a political community, the United States as a political community. Ben mentioned Tocqueville. When Tocqueville comes in the 1830s to America, he notices there's a new kind of patriotism in the New World. He comes from the minor French aristocracy. He says, monarchies, Europe, we have the old patriotism of sentiment, blood and soil and mythic tradition. It's the king and the queen, the nobility. The Americans have, it's translated in different ways, have a reflective patriotism or a considered patriotism, a rational patriotism. The Americans love America. They're very proud of America. I discovered as a foreigner, he said, if you say anything critical about America, the American Constitution, they're very thin-skinned, right? But they have this rational element, reflective, considered patriotism. They want to argue about America and what it means. They want to argue with the government. They want to argue with each other. They want to say, what's in it for me if I'm patriotic and I serve in office or I vote or I participate? How am I benefiting and how am I family friends? It's the reflective, rational patriotism. Tocqueville's calling us to be educated citizens. He says the Americans are. They take education very seriously. So reflective patriotism, a rational, considered, argumentative patriotism fits with freedom of speech. Okay? But it also leads to these it's the source of these 2 other civic virtues I want to close with. Civil disagreement as a civic virtue. If you're going to have speech, it has to be civil, not angry, demonizing, violent speech. And the third civic virtue, civic friendship. That Jane and I may disagree about a particular public policy topic or a law or something like that, but we appreciate that we are fellow citizens. We are civic friends across our philosophical views, our party views and allegiances. Not that they're not there, right? And we have a former member of Congress here, right? From the era when Congress worked. On the principle that, Glenn's a Democrat, but he's serving with Republicans. Well, the Republicans are wrong. They're not evil, right? And he's got Republican colleagues who could say the same thing about them. They're going to argue with Glenn, but we need to govern. We need to pass a law. So reflective patriotism, civil disagreement, civic friendship as fellow Americans. And some of this is in the spirit of the Declaration itself, right? The beginnings of our government. It's reasoned arguments and evidence for why we must fight, continue to fight, undertake this revolution. And it closes with an invocation of honor, right? As free people and human beings, we, the signers, mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. It's an honor to fight for these principles, but there are principles, which means we need to live up to them. And I'll close with this. What does this mean for campuses today? I suggest to you, because we have a deficit of civic education, and my discipline is more at fault than any other. Political science departments stopped doing this, stopped requiring it in universities and colleges. We have a deficit of civic knowledge and of civic virtues because we have a deficit of civic education among the citizenry at large. And a major sign of a failure there is a failure to appreciate the importance of freedom of speech in its appropriate, more high-minded mode of civil disagreement.
So, you're a hard act to follow, Paul. I want to thank Ben and his colleagues for bringing us here. I've never been to this corner of your beautiful state, and I'm thrilled to be here on Constitution Day. I am not a scholar of the Constitution. I'm not going to pretend to be one on TV. I've had anxiety dreams that I have, Paul is quizzing me on articles and sections. At least I'm wearing pants, so it's not fully working out one of those anxiety dreams. And I've got my my cheat pocket Constitution. I'm going to give you a little preamble, and then I have 3 articles. See, I'm conceding. And the preamble is about educating for American democracy, which is the project on which my civic friend and I have worked over several years to create a framework braiding history and civics for education K-12. It's an inquiry-based framework. It's not a national curriculum. It's leveraging that distributive federalism that Paul talked about, and it makes these principles of civil disagreement, civic friendship, and reflective patriotism the hardware of the framework. It has been a thrilling part of my career as a historian to work deliberately with people who were engineered to disagree. We chose each other because we disagreed on some of these fundamental issues, and to think about places where we could full-throatedly move forward together and places where we should surface our disagreements, and invite teachers to surface disagreement in the classroom so that students learn to flex those muscles. So that's my preamble, is educating for American democracy as a school for civic friendship and reflective patriotism in the making, as well as in the project. I teach the American Revolution at Harvard. I stop it before the Constitution. I stop in 1783. And I do that on purpose. And I'm gonna throw that down as a principle, and I bet we will want to come back to it. So the first article of my brief remarks is the 4 themes that organize my teaching on the American Revolution, which proceeds, as historians do, in a pretty conventional. It has a middle, it has I don't give it an end. That's why I don't go to the Constitution. And those 4 themes are as follows. 1, the American Revolution did not have to happen. We're not talking about a destiny. We're talking about a set of contingent and irreproducible conditions and events that produced particular urgencies and outcomes, but it did not have to happen. And all of these point in a similar direction, which you'll get when I get to the 4th one. So that's number 1. American Revolution did not have to happen. Number 2 is that we are a people that does not believe in golden idols, no more kings, right? This is an animating principle of the American Revolution. I could show you dozens of engravings of people pulling down statues in 1776 when they heard the Declaration of Independence read. So having been raised as subjects in British America, what it meant to be citizens of a republic that had just declared itself into being was to refuse to acknowledge leaders as perfect species. No more golden statues on horseback. This is my answer to sort of purely celebratory visions of 1776. That's not our hardware. We are a people who's born in questioning the wisdom of our founders, which I think is part of reflective patriotism. The 3rd theme that organizes my course is that the American Revolution was a civil war. It's not an emanation of everybody getting to the same set of ideals at the same time. It's a working out of profound differences across the population of 13 rebellious colonies that became the United States. Those included differences of region, There's already strong North-South tensions. You can see it in Jefferson's notes on the Articles of Confederation in 1778. There are strong urban-rural tensions, which come out in the Federalist, anti-Federalist reasoning on the Constitution. There are obviously strong racial inequalities in this polity, in which 1 in 5 people was enslaved, and in which there were enslaved people in every single colony, not only the ones in the South. There are economic differences that are not only about enslavement. There are gender differences. Women have a different experience of the events of the American Revolution than men do. But a civil war in which people who have hitherto understood themselves as British citizens come to make choices. Many of them make multiple choices over the course of the same war. Roughly 2/5 of the American population were consistent patriots, a minority, right? At least 1/3 are consistent loyalists, and most are vacillating in the middle. So a civil war in unexpected places, not just in the parts of British America that became the United States. And then the fourth theme that animates my whole course is that the American Revolution is unfinished. Unfinished then, unfinished now, that we are still doing the work of figuring out how this polity is going to move forward, that it's on all of us to rake over these ideals. And I agree with Paul that we should study the Declaration and the Constitution. I think we should also study the petitions in which ordinary people mobilize that language to make their own claims on the new American state. We should study these things not because they are new golden idols, but because they are tools. So my 4 themes is Article 1. Article 2 is, what do we mean by a founding? We're in a kind of culture war about this in the United States, right? What do we mean by a founding? And I will sketch under the banners of 1619 and Trump 1776 Commission 2 caricatures of what a founding can mean. In several sentences of Nicole Hannah-Jones's prequel to the 1619 Project, which, by the way, is all anybody ever means when they refer to 1619, is a few sentences in the introductory essay. That's what we fight about. The founding is kind of a prison. It's a destiny, right? We are founded in enslavement. It's our DNA, and the inequalities set in motion in 1619, written into the Constitution in many different ways, though the word slavery never appears there, are our inescapable genealogy. That's one version of a founding. It's a prison. It's a box we can't get out of. The 45th president's sort of equal and opposite version is that a founding is a glorious destiny, a garden of heroes. I've already said my No More Kings version means that this is false to the 18th century, as well as, I believe, not what we need in the 21st. So the founding is neither a heaven nor a hell, I think, in the view of anybody who studies it seriously in any way, but a foundation, right? What if we think of a founding not as something with a calligraphy capital F? The phrase founding fathers is invented in 1920, not in 1776, but as a foundation, the foundation on which the house of our peoplehood is built. So let me play with this metaphor a bit. And I think I'll tell you a short story as I play with this metaphor of foundation. In 2006, my husband and I moved across town in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And next to us was an enormous house that was raised on jack lifts, sitting maybe 18 inches above the ground, while some enormous project went on below ground. And we asked this neighbor, who has not become a close friend, I will say, not a civic friend or otherwise. We asked this neighbor, your house is levitating. What's going on? And he said, I I bought this thing without an inspection contingency, and it turned out the foundation was rotten. And so, I've had to bring in this earth moving equipment. We're trying to rebuild the foundation while the house still stands above it. Eventually, we're going to reattach it, and it will all be fine. You can build anything on a sound foundation. You can't build anything on a rotten one. And repairing it when you have neglected it. This house was built in 1888. You've neglected it for more than 100 years. Is a very expensive proposition. You may know the invocation to foundation in Matthew 7. A wise man builds his house upon a rock, and a foolish man builds his house upon sand. The most famous invocation of house building in American political history is Lincoln in Illinois in 1858. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Also quoting Matthew. So I think he has this idea of, can you have a sound house on a rotten foundation? Does that mean that the foundation in the Constitution becomes itself a golden idol? I think it does not, right? It's designed to be a closely monitored and reparable foundation. That's what the amendments process is, right? Is thinking, does the foundation still support all of us who need to live in this house? The Reconstruction amendments say no. We need to build another part of our foundation so that all of our population can live in this house. What I hope this foundation metaphor, instead of the calligraphied golden capital F founding metaphor, can give us when we think about the Constitution, the Declaration, and other germinative utterances of the revolutionary period, is the idea of what the Puritans would have called a wrought covenant. The foundation is something that's built, and that we have, remember, the revolution is unfinished. We have a responsibility to continue to monitor and rebuild. If we find that water is getting in somewhere, what do we do? Do we just move all our stuff out of the basement, or do we think together with our civic friends about ways to repair it? So my third and last article, which is a sort of central EAD, what we call a design challenge, is about compromise. And it tacks back to Paul's free speech point about compromise in the work of honoring and repairing, continually repairing our foundations. If you have studied the American Constitution, even in high school or in 8th grade, you know that the Constitution was built on compromise, some of it glorious and some of it painful and horrible, right? So we have the compromise that allows us to have a bicameral legislature with different portions, different schemes of representation in each house. We have within that great compromise a compromise about how the proportion of the population will be determined, that winds up giving Southerners credit as slaveholders for three-fifths of their bound human population. The EAD design challenge is, how can we both celebrate and critique compromise? I think in the last 50 years of American life, we've gotten very good at critiquing compromise. Right, you give an inch, you lose a mile is a principle of our contemporary politics, and certainly there are constitutional compromises that do not deserve celebration. Though, as we critique, we ought to think about them and reckon with them as the price of the union. What is the price that people were willing to pay for union, and why? Was it a price worth paying? How would we know? Right? Like, these are the questions that in an inquiry curriculum lead us back into deep questioning and reasoning from evidence. I'll close by bringing this compromise point back to the work of Educating for American Democracy, which was the work in which Paul and I met. We designed a center-left to center-right coalition that engineered this framework. it's really hard to hold a coalition together. And to your free speech point, I think part of the way you do that is that everybody needs to be heard. More than that, everybody needs to be listened to, not agreed with, but listened to. And we made some significant compromises along the way, right? Embodying this design challenge of both celebrating and critiquing compromise. We each gave up enough, the 6 principal investigators and then the 300 people who really supported this pyramid of discovery and knowledge production. We each gave up enough that it hurt a little, and we each gained enough that it made the giving up worthwhile. And I think we had a kind of civic dialogue where we could continually take the temperature of that. What this has meant for this coalition in the wake of publishing this framework in March of 2021, I believe, and I'm curious to hear about this from Paul's perspective on the rightward end of the coalition. I think what it meant was that we had enough trust and belief in the work that we had done together that when a culture war was thrown at us, we hung tough, right? And to tie this back to the period of the American Revolution before turning it over to Ben for questions, the forces of disunion are always very strong, right? The 13 colonies, you all know the quote from John Adams, it was like teaching 13 clocks to strike as one. The 13 colonies of 1776 were wildly different places, way more different from each other than the countries of the European Union. At the time of the First Continental Congress in 1774, more representatives to Congress had been to London than had been to any other colony in North America. The forces of disunion, of distinction, the underside of federalism is very strong, right? The sort of, I never remember which is centrifugal and which is centripetal, but the one that pushes out. Union is something that needs to be continually rethought when our foundation is a set of argued about words on paper and not a common genetic inheritance, a common language, an attachment of blood to soil, which was the case for so many of our rootstock nations. So I'm proud of our compromises together, even some of the most painful ones. And as a teacher, and I hope in this conversation this afternoon, we can talk about the borders of when you compromise and when you don't, and what you get out of either of those positions in the work of our unfinished American Revolution, which we all have to hang in together if we want to keep it. Thanks.
5 hours.
My water bottle.
Thank you both. There's a lot to digest and chew on there, but maybe one opening question we can start with is, you've both brought up the need for reflection, for reason, for conversation, but that seems to be more challenging in an age where we have far more ease to do this. How do we build trust in our networks, in our lives to do this? And what have you guys perhaps learned through your experience with the EAD about how to build trust to have these dialogues and conversations that we need to maintain our foundation?
It's difficult to begin in a period of deficit. We have been deficit spending our civic culture. It's a problem in American life generally. Put it on the credit card, right? We've been deficit spending our common civic culture, weakening the foundation for, I was born in the mid-late 60s, right? My entire lifetime. So to start to try to rebuild or to pay back the debt owed, rebuild civic capital from that difficult period is when you need to do it most, and it's also very hard. So for us, it was a group of academic and experienced school teachers, curriculum people who had enough of the older spirit, I think, along with the civic virtue of the civic virtues we wrote about. Enough of us had them. And the one I didn't mention is civic courage to take the risk. So some in the initial founding group for the EAD study knew me, but Jane didn't know me. Right? And so the credit goes to this group of left-wing Marxists up in Cambridge, who, center left people, Harvard, Tufts, iCivics. iCivics is, studied neutral center, but they wanted to reach out to a conservative, a constitutional conservative on the other side of the country, public university, because that's what renewal, that's what study of, and then the possibility of renewal of American civics and history education required to overcome the culture wars, which were a source of downward spiraling and further deficit spending. So the civic courage to reach out and say, we want this conservative to be part of the author group. But the trust that we pretty quickly started to build showed the payoff. So I'll invoke another phrase from Tocqueville. Tocqueville talks about the Americans having an enlightened self-interest. The enlightened part is a capacity to think of benefit for others, benefit for a community, for a common good, for a polity. But the Americans, right, this reflective, considered patriotism, there's a self-interest to the American civic commitment to serve in public office, to, or civic associations, school board meeting, or a church or a temple, or Girl Scouts or whatever it might be, right? You're giving of time and effort and talent and treasure, but you think it's going to be good for you, yourself, your family, your friends. This enlightened self-interest, this way of balancing the two. I think we all started to see a kind of benefit. The risk was taken, and there was benefit to the larger enterprise, and it was sort of thrilling and rewarding to be working on a compromise, because we were persuaded, as the framers must have been, and other compromises throughout American history, that the price paid for the compromise was worth it, because there was something better that was going to come out of this.
So I guess I would add to that, none of these civic virtues is natural, right? We should not assume a level of comfort with disagreement and dispute to be natural. And I'll tell a story from my past that feels analogous to me, and if it doesn't to you, I'll try to unpack it. So my first year in graduate school, I had somebody tell me for the first time that I was a terrible writer. And I think he was entirely correct. He's a very gifted historian. And I sort of took this as a label. Like, it turns out I'm a terrible dancer. And okay, so now this is another thing that I'm just not good at. But as a teacher, Professor Cronin went forward and further and said, that's okay. Writing isn't like dancing. Writing is something you have to learn to do. Here's a set of steps. Like, let's work on sentences, and then let's work on paragraphs, and then we can work on pages, and then chapters and books. And so I think recognizing that this work is hard and not natural and needs to be taught places a different burden on each of us, right? Those of you in the room who are instructors at one level or another, you have to figure out how to teach it. Those of you who are students need to trust your faculty to go along and teach civil disagreement skills, just like you weren't born knowing algebra or the countries of Latin America on a map. So I think it's significantly an instructional proposition, and in the EAD landscape, we were able to curate and select for people who were either well-trained or well-disposed to this work, but I wonder if we do well by presuming that we're all untrained. We should talk also about where that civic deficit came from. Like, we could think of this civic deficit, which I would put back to 1968 or a bit before. It's a kind of training, right? Like, also the distrust is not entirely natural. We were schooled up in that distrust. We still have many forces in the political culture of the United States reinforcing that distrust. So it's a question of being curious enough about each other. And I think that's one habit of mind that we could also call out as a civic virtue, is curiosity. Curious enough about each other to unlearn one set of training, to distrust and disagreement and winner takes all kind of zero-sum understanding of our foundations, and try something different. I think outside of school walls, there's a set of civil society organizations that have organized to do this kind of training. Braver Angels is the one that I think is most accessible to most people. There's also living room conversations. Like, if it's work you want to do in your neighborhood to seek out people who disagree on something. I'll tell one last story in this connection. I think Paul is correct that I have moved from the Stalinist left to the Trotskyite left slowly over time. And my older son, who has described himself to me as the most woke person he knows, and sort of batted away my blandishment that a truly woke person wouldn't talk about how woke they were. He said to me at some point early in this EAD work, so 2019, 2020, I think you're becoming conservative. And I said, I'm not becoming conservative, but I am a kind of vigorous centrist. And he said, I hate the center. I hate the center more than the radical right. And I said, well, that's just moronic. Like, that's just broken. You know, that's not what politics is about. Politics is about finding somebody with whom you can work on anything, and then building out from that one point of intersection and seeing who else you can bring into the coalition that might want something else. And he said, no, politics is about finding the smallest number of people with whom you can agree on everything. And that's the civic deficit training, right? Is to think that what it means to function civically is the same thing that it means to hit a like on Instagram. He's not quite that anymore at 25, and I do tell that story a lot.
The Educating for American Democracy initiative focuses on civic education within the K through 12 setting. Is there a place for civic education in higher education? And if so, what does it look like? Or if not, why should civic education be limited just to K to 12?
The report itself, Educating for American Democracy, and you go to the website with that long title, educatingforamericandemocracy.org, scintillating reading. In the report, and then the roadmap itself, highly recommended. The report itself calls for renewal of civics and history education in higher education, public, private, whatever it is, because there's an ecosystem of K through 16, if you think about it, right? And it isn't just school teachers, future school teachers who need an appropriate civics and history education, as if it's only the civics, social studies, history teachers themselves who need it. Every member of a K-12 school community who's in a teaching position or a leadership position, but then think of the school board, right? And it isn't just the principals, think of all the assistant superintendents and the superintendents, right? If I'm the principal of a school and my background's in chemistry, why should I give time in the day and resources to the civics and history people, especially when in the larger ecosystem over time, it's worked out that civics history is so controversial, it happens naturally, it's not really academically serious, certainly the civics part isn't. It's not tested. It's not a priority. It's also controversial. Why go there? So over decades, it becomes neglected as a subject. Well, so the whole ecosystem needs to be rebuilt. And I'll mention here a second resource. The president of Johns Hopkins University, which is the first research university founded in the United States, private university, on the European, especially the German model of research, cutting edge knowledge, right? Got to do away with or have an alternative to these old liberal arts colleges kind of thing. The current president of Johns Hopkins University wrote a book a couple of years ago, simple title, you should look it up, What Universities Owe Democracy. And his answer is a civic education, by which he means civic and historical education appropriate for free citizens of a liberal democracy, American liberal democracy. And it has to be at every kind of higher education entity, large, small, private, public, research universities like his own. And he says an unintended cost casualty of the research university. He says, Johns Hopkins is a wonderful place. Research university is a wonderful place. An unintended price casualty cost, the loss of the civic citizenship education that came with the liberal arts model, right? So Jacksonville State started as a normal school, right? Arizona State University started as the Tempe Normal School, a school to educate educators, school teachers in norms, both intellectual and the term now would be behavioral. What they meant was in virtues, and they included civic virtues. The Tempe Normal School is teaching civic education, civics and government as part of it. And I'm sure it was here in Jacksonville as well, right? So that used to happen at higher education. Civics government was a part of the, it's understood that everyone graduating with a bachelor's degree is going to be a leader in a profession, in civic life, perhaps in political life. So the whole thing needs to be rebuilt. And his argument is a required civic knowledge course or two, civic historical knowledge. And then the second part, and we can talk about it more, he calls it pluralism, purposeful pluralism, experiences of speakers on campus who are disagreeing with each other. And Jane and I need to do a better job of, I'll try and find something to argue about. Disagreeing with each other and seeing these virtues, civil disagreement, civic friendship, so the students can experience it and see that it's valuable in addition to the required civic knowledge.
Yeah, so to go back to my American Revolution is unfinished principle, I think if we're going to continue that work, we have to address it at every lever point in society, right? So it's not just K-12, it's not just education, right? It's also museums, public spaces, reenactment organizations, Elks Club, bowling leagues, neighborhoods. I have a particular theory about how higher ed got out of this business in the 60s. And I think it's because civics smelled too much like religion. Right. So that the business of molding character in higher ed felt like a civic religion at the time of the Vietnam War, where skepticism of institutions ran so high that universities could not justify being in that business. And indeed, I think there is something sacred about the work of molding participants in the cultural life of a republic. So I think, if you are here in the United States in 2023, finishing the work of the American Revolution is your job. And wherever you spend your professional life, you have to figure out a way of doing a piece of that job. I think colleges have an unusual opportunity set because we bring people together who are not in each other's pathways normally, right? Whether that's a community college from which people are, or to which people are commuting, or an elite residential campus like mine, which is bringing people from all over the country and all over the world who might never otherwise be in a room together. We need to lean into that opportunity of unintentional sets, right? Like what, I think one of the big challenges in American life in the 21st century is we are so sorted, right? Your zip code tells more about the way that your life is going to turn out than anything else. And your neighbors are probably like you in a whole set of ways. And you probably watch the same TV and circulate the same memes. College is a disruptor that way. You're not in college with the people from next door as you were if you went to public school. So as educators, I think, it's our job. The foundation's in the basement. We got to take people down to the basement and look at the walls and figure out how we're going to move forward in this work together. I think, there are various sort of talking shops in higher ed trying to figure out what civic work in higher ed will, can look like. And the school that Paul leads at ASU is a leader in that work.
I would love to know what Paul U and Jane U look like as far as required courses then, but I will save that because I do want to, get to
I
audience
might compromise and allow history courses, but not many of them. Yeah. Political science should be the first. Yeah.
The first required, yeah.
I actually don't think it's a disciplinary proposition,
Yeah,
right? The
that's good.
civic friendship and civil disagreement, you could be doing in your STEM classes, right? Like you just have to seek out difference and build the skills and revel in difference rather than being afraid of it.
Great.
I do think history and politics have particular content domains from which to teach it, but it belongs in the arts classroom and in the mechanical engineering classroom too.
I'll end with this question, then hand it over to the audience. Can you just tell us at least about one disagreement perhaps you had as you were crafting the EAD, and what you learned from that disagreement with each other?
Oh God, I don't even remember. You go.
Okay, well, I'll mention two from the very beginning. Talking about sorting. So this group of professionals who knew each other in the Cambridge area, unsorted. They got out of their bubble and reached all the way over to Arizona to a conservative, way out of the comfort zone, and said, this is what's needed to study. But the grant was to study the status of, the condition of civics and history education in K-12 public schools. How can we study that unless we have somebody from the intellectual conservative side, and more than one person, right? So they unsorted. Right from the very beginning, I said I was delighted, honored. I knew some of the folks. I didn't know Jane. I would like the word American to be in the title of our grant application. It came to me as educating for democracy. And I grew up in a New Deal Democratic family in Northern New York and in the Northeast. Went to undergraduate school and graduate school in New England. Got smarter as I grew older and shifted to be a conservative. And that's a journey some people go on. And sort of this patriotism element, but also the empirical dimension. We're asking for a grant from the United States federal government, the United States of America federal government. It's not educating for democracy on Mars, right? Or somewhere else. It's civic education means a particular civic community educating for American democracy. Fairly quickly, it was okay. But the word American is difficult now in higher education and K-12 settings because it seems discriminatory, right? There are other peoples and places in the Americas, right? And it's discriminatory in privileges, a certain, I don't know, Anglo or Caucasian or powerful or whatever American, right? But that compromise came, a more difficult one was the democracy word. So from the beginning, I wanted to hedge or balance or qualify or moderate that word democracy, American democracy. And then my next outrageous set of demands and others that we brought into the study, right, is some very distinguished intellectual conservatives who participated in the study who agreed to join. So I wasn't the only voice with this. Can we regularly qualify this term democracy in the study? Central term, constitutional, democracy, American democracy, democratic republic, right? So the term that's used in the Constitution about our form of government is republic. And conservatives get really bothered about this. We should only be talking about republic, right? On the other hand, the equality principle there from the beginning. And Alexis de Tocqueville, who admired the American Constitution with all of its Republican features, its other than democratic features, right? He decides to entitle the work, the real story here is democracy in America, right? The social phenomenon of equality, democratic government with Republican forms, right? So I wasn't objecting that we're going to use that word democracy. We're going to also, could we use the word republic every now and again? Can we say constitutional democracy, American democracy, et cetera? So that was a little harder. But we all saw the final analysis and the final set of recommendations would be stronger if this compromise was accepted.
I would say on the history side, so I ran an American history task force in the discovery phase of the work. And there, the big debates were about the balance between what we call the glory and the gory. So how fully can we acknowledge the wrongs, past and present, and almost certainly future, since we're all fallen human beings, of the British colonies and the United States, while still celebrating our peoplehood, the miracle of our peoplehood. It was fought out question by question and theme by theme, and one guiding question that wound up in the framework that I think came through this contestation was about rights. So we have a theme about the founding, theme 4, a new government and constitution, and then we have a theme about revisions to the foundation, theme 5, which is its subtitle is a series of refoundings, and that looks at Reconstruction and social movements and religious revivals and other ways of going down to the basement and shoring up that foundation, making sure the water isn't getting in. So there's a rights question in theme 5 that treats in the same question freedom of speech, gun rights, abortion rights, religious freedoms. I think it's a group of sort of content points under the umbrella of rights that you wouldn't have seen if we didn't have this broad political coalition saying, well, that's the right you care about. What about the right that I care about? And so I think in many cases, the resolution to stuck points in our discussions was the improvisational principle of yes and. So that, yes, and we can say a constitutional democracy because they're both true. A good civic education requires you to hold competing things in your head at once.
Questions from the audience. We can take both virtual questions. So if you're online, you can type in a question, but I'll start with any in-house questions that we have.
So I'm interested going back to the last question about this role in higher education, and particularly for a university like ours, and I'm sure Arizona State, maybe less so Harvard, but the emphasis on vocational education and practical skills. How do we convince both administrators and state legislators, but parents and students as well, that taking this time in civic education, and I would argue the greater humanities, is really necessary, and that going to college is simply not, a means to an end, it's a means to a great life?
Yeah, so I think you can make this argument in the language of workforce capacitation, right? It's not what motivates me to get up in the morning and do higher ed, like, oh, I'm going to go out and capacitate future workers, although that is our job when we're training young people. There are very few workplaces in the United States or anywhere else that are entirely homogenous. And there's a whole body of research that suggests that people produce better as knowledge workers and other kinds of workers when they can get more opinions and navigate difference, right? Like this is a baseline. DEI argues in a workforce capacitation model, right? Like we need diverse perspectives in order to be stronger after college, and I think we can adopt that too. The other, sort of framework that I think legislators understand is national security. It's a matter of national security, right? Low information voters are a threat to national security, no matter which voters you consider are low information. So I think there are very practical answers that don't sound just like developing the humanistic virtues that are actually why I think we're on Earth, that you can use to code switch with your deans.
I'll just chime in and give a bit more of the high-minded version and then the more utilitarian version, right? I think it's intellectually, academically serious to talk about the phenomenon of being a citizen and being patriotic, grateful for a particular kind of constitutional republic. My discipline has forgotten that. This is not academically serious. I think to some extent, a lesser extent, the history discipline has forgotten that as well. It's an extraordinary achievement in all of human civilization to have these forms of government, to have these constitutions to argue about and try to perfect or reform or revise. So it's academically very serious. The more self-interested reasons you could mention, so sort of putting aside patriotism and the academic seriousness of it, the self-interested reason for higher education is that higher education itself is a casualty of the polarization and decline of civic culture that's eating at all of our institutions. Higher education's feeling it later in the cycle, but it's arrived, right? In the past 10 years, all of the polling about the value that you see in higher education, is higher education providing benefit to Americans? All those numbers are down. They're underwater if you self-identify as a conservative or Republican, right? That is not a happy story for higher education, just as there's a sort of demographic concern about decline for enrollment. It is in the enlightened self-interest of higher education to rediscover civic education, citizenship preparation for a number of reasons. They can make a better economic argument, invest in us, private dollars, public dollars, tuition dollars, because we will prepare you for workforce and for life. The civic skills are the same as trying to, and we will have better standing with the public, with a broader public. And we will have better standing with our state legislatures and our governors if we are providing a civic citizenship preparation education. So those are among the arguments.
I think we're still more trusted than Congress.
The late John,
not by a lot.
Yeah, the late John McCain used to say before he died, with the numbers that Congress has, we're down to like family members, staff. That's the only people who have any, right? And we're not even getting those, right? Yeah. We're not that bad yet. Yeah.
Talked a lot about the K-12 part of it in the form of civic mindedness. What I have seen, and as a parent, I see this now, and I see this as a college student even more, is that there is such an emphasis on math and science because we're competing against other countries. We're always competing with them for jobs. We're always competing with them. So much so from what I've seen in school and everything like that. Do you believe that it should be more maybe incentivized for these states to encourage a civic debate? And I mean, there's people that are going to be afraid to speak in public. But shouldn't there be at least more incentives for these schools to have these civic talks, to have these civic meetings? I'm originally from Dallas, Texas, and we had the Tate Lecture Series where we heard many people, and it's amazing on how few people actually attended those, which was very sad to me. But shouldn't that also be part of our high schools, part of our PTAs to have group meetings like this?
It's a great point. The it's rebuild. Where do you begin? How do you get out of the cycle? How do you rebuild the civic culture? As I mentioned, Ron Daniels, What Universities of Democracy, includes this, right? The civic culture of pluralism, purposeful pluralism, rebuilding it. In terms of incentivizing funding, as Jane knows well, there have been some efforts to redress the imbalance of federal funding. So one statistic that we discovered in the course of writing a study, it's a bit dated now, but in the year 2016, again, K-12 education is the primary responsibility of the states. Primary sources of funding would come from the states, but the federal government spends a fair bit of money on K-12. So the federal study discovered across all the different sources of federal funding going out to the states, about $55 per student per year was going to STEM in some way, right? Science, technology, math funding, versus 5 cents per student per year to civics history education. It's 1,000 to 1 ratio. Okay. Now, part of that comes from the Sputnik era, national defense security spending. An external threat says we got to up our game. It's less politically controversial to be funding math and technology and science. It's less polarized. It's easier for members of Congress, presidents, political culture to do that. But that degree of imbalance coming from the federal government feeds into the polarization that's present in every local education authority and state to continue this view to say it's too risky, it's not a priority. I will say one kind of thinking we developed during the study and after the study, trying to spread the word about it and argue about it, is that it's difficult to see ourselves as the enemy, right? So in the 1950s, it was the Soviet Union, Sputnik. We've got to dump money into the federal government needs to dump money into K-12 education. And most of that from the beginning was STEM. In the 1980s, it was, a nation at risk. It was competitiveness, right? So that, it's very interesting to think that from the Reagan administration, and it was a bipartisan coalition effort behind that study, and renewal of public education, the emphasis went toward math and science and reading basics, and civics and history was an afterthought in a nation at risk study, and all the academic reform measures taken afterward. So there's an external, we rebuilt the West German economy, Japan, Korea, they're now eating our lunch competitively. We need to, right? External enemy, it's more difficult to see ourselves as the enemy. So this is one of Lincoln's genius insights in 1838, the perpetuation address, perpetuation of our Republican institutions. We are a threat to ourselves. No Napoleon is going to come and defeat us militarily, take a drink out of the Ohio River. It's not going to happen. But we could die by suicide. And a major cause of it would be civic ignorance of the laws and the Constitution and the civic virtues needed. So it's hard to see that we are a problem. We need to reinvest in ourselves. It doesn't happen. I do think while I'm droning on, there was sort of a wind of history effect during all this as well. Even in the 1980s, a difficult period, difficult after Vietnam, sort of confidence that we're going to win this Cold War thing, or if there's a detente, we're going to be fine. And then certainly in the 1990s, right? We won. We're the best, right? Why do you need to invest in civic education? It happens automatically, right? We will triumph. It's turned out we've learned a bitter lesson that if you don't pay attention to this, prioritize it, invest in it, things do not go well.
I hear your question as a how more than a whether question, right? Like we have to find the time in the instructional day. We have to mobilize school communities to this, like we're like my neighbor, right? Otherwise we're gonna have to jack up the house, and that is really expensive, and really painful, right? And nobody has a place to live in the meantime. I think part of the priority to STEM is a stick rather than a carrot. It's high stakes testing. And that has a whole set of downstream consequences in the way that the instructional day is structured. So should we be fighting for high stakes testing in history and social studies? I think one of the reasons we haven't is because of the impossibility of having a national curriculum, that we can all agree on for teaching civic principles. So how do we have that fight? And I think a key, how do we successfully fight for an increase of real estate in the instructional day and a greater capacitation of our teacher workforce so that they can do, you probably know, you may know that history is still the subject that is least often taught at the K-12 level with somebody with a subject area BA, right? Nobody in your science classroom lacks a science degree, but there's a very high chance that the person in your social studies classroom, even if you have social studies, which you don't before 5th grade, doesn't have a history or a government degree. So high stakes testing and capacitation of that workforce may be part of the answer. I think another part of the answer that your question throughout is we have to work with and not against parents. Like it's a terrifying moment for teachers, school boards, and parents. And unless we bring parents into the tent, like let's take parents to the basement, it's leaking, unless we invest them as stakeholders in solving this problem, whether we believe in it or not, we will lose. Like there is no way to fight through parents to get civic education in the schools. So anybody who has an algorithm about how we can involve parents, one of the ways that I've been working on this is with an EAD task force for non-classroom educators, museums, and libraries, and the kinds of school group work that they do, which is a little diffused. The time bomb is a little diffused from the sort of curriculum wars. So mobilizing other civil society stakeholders, I think we have to do it, but the how is very much in question, and I suspect it's a yes and answer. Yes, fighting for high stakes testing. Yes, doing professional learning development, and then leveraging PTAs, leveraging girls and boys clubs, leveraging outside of walls classroom educators in the fight.
Thank you for attending or coming to Jacksonville. My colleague is a historian. I'm a political scientist.
Look at you sitting
more of a
rightist,
rightist, more of a leftist. So we're just opposite, and we share beer once in a while, so it can be done. And we're both named Paul, yes. So my question is, you mentioned that there's a lack of civic education. If that is so, how do we get the trust back? We've got so many people that think they know that I'm right. I've got this cognitive dissonance, and I've heard it, and I've watched it, and I've been confirmed bias in and out. How do we get to those people that they're not in K-12 anymore? They've graduated from college. We're never going to encounter them in mass. So are we in this gap? Do we just take a breather and say, okay, let's just let's see what washes through, and we'll start with the students that are in K-12 and higher ed, and at least we can restart it? Or what do we do with the people that we don't have contact with, and how do we reach them?
Any other questions? Anybody else have a question? In Plato's Republic, there's a marvelous line when one of the younger people in the dialogue says to Socrates, but how would you actually establish this ideal political order, the most just political order? And Socrates answers, it's easy. Glaucon or Adeimantus, it's easy. You just expel everyone over the age of 10, and then you just, start all over again. And it's, taken as the Platonic awareness that philosophizing is very important, but the practical challenge is how would you actually do this? Sort of a self-critique. And on the both end, theme. Multiple efforts, try a lot of things. Some of them will fail. Anybody you can engage, anybody of goodwill with remaining civic awareness and reflective patriotism, all hands on deck effort, and try a lot of things across multiple sectors. If you can show cross-ideological, bipartisan civic friendship in the effort, that might reach one side of the spectrum or another side of the spectrum to say, well, it's not unicorns they're talking about. It can be done. You can talk, show examples of times when American politics, local to state to national, and the civic culture and civil society worked. But it's not. I have been by name criticized by other conservatives for joining this effort as a sellout. I was a dupe to not know I was being used as the sort of Trojan horse. Yeah. The Trojan horse, or I was the wolf. I was the sheep skin over the wolf of these left-leaning, America-hating, Marxists that I was writing with. So there's a risk there to talk about not a conservative civic education that's needed or a progressive civic education needed, but a common American effort at a civic education. So I know I just pulled a Plato on you. I didn't really give you very practical. Very practical answer.
I think I do. There is some of me that thinks like, well, if we start with the 8th graders, like if we could just start with the 8th graders and sustain the flow through. Although the people you're talking about are also their parents, right? So if we can think about our classrooms as community ecosystems that extend to parents and grandparents, that may be one way. I have a lot of great ideas that I don't act on. I would be rich if I acted on all my ideas. One, by the way, for anybody who has a business plan out there, a mix of coconut and oat milk called Coconut. So
You heard it here first.
Early in the Trump administration, I had an idea that I was calling my red state friend, my blue state friend, where you could set up a crossing network, like an e-trading network, where you would put in your zip code and you'd be matched with somebody who put in their zip code, but had the opposite political proportions that you did, and have a structured conversation. You remember, I'm saying like everybody reads the New York Times, but the New York Times has 32 questions to fall in love. If you agree to sit with somebody and talk about, like, oh, what was your favorite movie? Or, you go through these 32 questions and you have eye contact. And at the end of it, if you've made a connection, it's a real and durable connection. And you would come up with a political set of the 32 questions and you'd hang in together. So Braver Angels has basically done this, right? They're facilitating and curating living room conversations. Anybody who's willing to be curious can participate in a Braver Angels group for free. And I think modeling curiosity is really constructive with all the social connections we have. And in my own my own neighborhood is useless. Here's another story about my children. When they were in kindergarten and pre-kindergarten, they're a year apart in school. They had a mock election. I think this was 2004. And I had your mock election come out and they said, oh, it was 50-50. And I was like, really? It was 50-50 Bush Kerry? No, it was 50-50 Al Sharpton and Dennis Kucinich. So my neighborhood is not perhaps politically viable, but in this work with people who you reach out to, I think you start with what you share, right? We all want a better world for ourselves and our families. Whatever our families or our chosen families look like, we all want a better future for them. What is, you ask questions. What does that mean for you? Oh, this is what it means for me. We agree on this. oh, does that mean you also want more playground space? Then we can work on that. I mean, I think building out from common places with honesty and curiosity is for me a posture that works when I can get myself into places with people who politically disagree with me.
Just one footnote beyond that. A public institution that has started a small effort for reform, but it has spread to other states, is the effort that the Arizona government made in 2016 to say that the largest university in the state capital, Arizona State University, will have this new department on civic thought and leadership, funded directly by the legislature and the governor. It's now spread to 6 other states. State of Ohio right now.
Like cancer.
The state of Ohio right now is building 5 of them on 5 different campuses. As we've tried to spread the word, in the higher education spirit of debate, deliberation, disagreement. This is what free people do. This is what's academically worthy in a university setting. But I say to all the people who ask me about it, and one should be built in the state of Arizona on one of the campuses. Maybe Jacksonville State will be the first of it. These
Alabama. Is it Alabama?
Yeah, sorry. They should do 3 things: serious academic department, right? PhD scholars, degrees, curriculum. Second thing is a public speaker series available to anybody free of charge, and then video archive it so it's available on a YouTube channel showing civil disagreement about important civic, political, academic topics. And then the third is support by a PhD academic department for K-12 civics and history education, because the state governments are also the ultimate custodians of K-12 public education. So that's now spread to 7 states, and they're easily, another 10 states that are prime candidates to do this kind of thing. So
you also have had a question over here a number of times, so let's make sure we get to this woman in black and white.
Is there a potential or a framework to move away from the 2-party system? Not necessarily towards parliamentarianism, but it seems we could all mutually agree that the left and the right is perhaps disillusioned or even crazy, and then we could move towards the middle to form these coalitions that could possibly actually work towards the greater good, as I suppose it was supposed to be designed.
You're going to have a more informed view.
Jane's going to look to me as the political scientist. If politics is the art of the possible, it's more possible in the American political culture and the American electoral system as it is now, to recover the idea of the 2 parties. And we've had multiple versions of 2 parties, right? The current names, and it's been that way for a long time, Republican and Democratic, to make them what they once were, make each of them coalitions more than they are, from the ground up, local to state, and then a national coalition. So there's more heterogeneity or pluralism within each of those coalitions, and then the candidates that they nominate. That's more likely to happen. It's difficult to have 3rd parties in America. And the Republican Party was a 3rd party that became one of the dominant parties, but it's very rare, and it's difficult. I will say one outrageous suggestion is that the good intentions of the primary election system, a primary round, designed quite deliberately by Woodrow Wilson, a smart-ass political scientist, to weaken the party system. The party system is part of the problem. Parties are too strong. They're stopping reform and progress. He's a progressive. The unintended consequence of that, a century on, is to have a very severe rise in the opportunities for demagoguery and the practice of demagoguery, right? The angriest candidates winning, the more extreme candidates throwing bombs out toward the opposite party or the opposite political persuasion with their neat, tidy, outrageous, and impossible, solutions. So to think about how to reform the primary system so that the parties, I'll say sort of adult supervision by people experienced in politics. That's what the parties used to be, right? People who actually held office and worked with the coalition of their own party and worked with people on the other side of the aisle in the city council, in state government, whatever it might be, who understood the principles of compromise that had to happen within a party and across party lines. If there was a little more opportunity for those experienced people to have an influence on who the final round candidates are, to revise, not do away with the primary system, but to revise it in some way, I think that would be a very constructive reform.
There's a set of interesting democracy renovation proposals in a report called Our Common Purpose, which you can Google. I mean, it's hard to think of a multi-party system that works well, right? Like, you want Italy, Israel. I mean, but both parties are sclerotic, maybe even zombies, right? Like, I think we're seeing a transformation within each party that hasn't yet worked itself out. Non-winner take all congressional districts, right? Power sharing in congressional districts, growing Congress so that congressional representatives are not representing now hundreds of thousands of people each, so that Congress is actually closer to the people that they represent. The states that are experimenting with ranked choice voting are finding that it works very well. It's very hard to explain. So it's very hard to diffuse in an electorate. So I guess I have more faith in renovating the parties that, the function of a party is to organize differences productively, so we don't all fight as tribes. The parties have become tribal and have become identities, right? To say I'm a Democrat seems like it should tell you everything about me. I guess I see the better outcome as working to renovate the parties and what they do, and then in a multi-party system, just because I can't think of one that's great.
I agree with you in the sense that when you look at college students in the 1960s versus today, and you ask them, what's the point of college? In the 1960s, the dominant answer was to develop a meaningful life philosophy. And you look today and it's to get a career that makes me a lot of money. Like the whole shift in students understanding about the points of college. And I was just thinking through a lot of the things that you were talking about. And it seemed to me that another piece that you may add, if you went the route of adding to a college experience, would be adding in philosophy, because I think that is another field that we have lost along the way. That art of rhetoric, the ability to have reasoned arguments and things like that. I mean, I know I'm in psychology. We are the psychology and philosophy department. We have never been able to hire a philosophy professor in the 20 years I've been here because the university doesn't see the point. Like they said, why would you do that? You can't go get a job in philosophy. Why would you ever need that in a university? And it's kind of like, because that's part of being a reasoned body of knowledge. But that it's just, that's even harder to sell. But to me, that comes when you start talking about the virtues and things like the moral virtues also within that moral philosophy, and thinking through, to sell it back to educators of, you want ethical workers and you want those people that have a sense of morality is an important sell, but just kind of adding on that piece of thinking about teaching the art of reasoned debate and being able to hold those conflicting forces in your head. So, when I teach the history of psychology and I'm talking about empiricism versus rationalism, they're like, which is right? And I'm like, it's not a right, wrong question, but they just, because they're growing up in a science, they're used to what does the evidence show? And you're like, that's not the point of philosophy. And it's just so hard for them to come at having so little background in that field. So. It's just a comment. What's the question?
Well, I agree. I mentioned the Ron Daniels book. It's an interesting thought experiment. The authors of the Federalist knew of the recent works of, let's say, political science or political philosophy, we know that they read Hobbes and Locke and modern thinking. They don't cite any of those authors, partly for the rhetoric, the rhetorical reasons, but partly to get to the fundamental issues. They were issues about human nature and the trial and error of human history and lessons that could be learned from history. So they're citing Greek and Roman philosophers and biographers and historians, and they're citing Shakespeare, and so they're drawing on a humanistic, or what we would call liberal arts education, to understand the project of founding a new constitutional republic and constitutional order. And that's the sort of the utilitarian rationale to perpetuate and sustain that kind of politics. We might need to recover as required areas of learning, or encouraged areas of learning in universities, public and private, those kinds of study.
I know we're over time, but will you indulge us with 2 more questions that we have? Is that okay? If I'm gonna be a bit gluttonous, like Socrates here, for some ideas and some questions.
I also just struggle getting attention of like, hey, I want to ask a question, please. So I'm hoping this hasn't already been covered in language that's a bit higher than what I have the tools to comprehend. But something that I've noticed with today's lecture that maybe that's important to any conversation around civil agreements, disagreements, and general discussion is how black and white thinking is an overall hindrance to moving forward. I'm sure that everyone here has struggled with black and white thinking in some capacity. And I was wanting to ask someone who I deem more qualified than me in this, how you could even begin to challenge those thoughts in both yourself, if you happen to notice it, and in others in the name of, say, compromise and moving forward.
Yeah, I totally agree that I would call it zero-sum thinking, either or thinking, angels and devils thinking is, totally describes the state of our politics right now, and it's the enemy to any kind of forward movement. The EAD answer to this is ask questions, right? Like ask questions where you can, constitutional phrase, a more perfect union, right? You're groping towards a better answer. You're giving the tools to students to assess what makes an answer better and worse based on evidence. You can go to the evidence, but that they don't have an easy right answer, that there's more than one way to answer a question constructively and correctly. I guess, when you hear that kind of thinking in yourself and in your media and from your fellows and your parents, can you call it out? Can you ask is there something in between? What are we not seeing? Right? The Mill argument for civil disagreement and freedom of speech is that the person who disagrees, start from the premise that the person who disagrees with you might be right. This was another sort of principle of our cross-coalitional work. Presume good faith. The reality TV mantra, I'm not here to make friends, I'm here to win. Be here to make friends. Because I think you're totally right. The philosophy is Manichaeanism, right? You're either this or that. And it's we see the destructive impacts all around us.
To add to that, that was wonderful. Just to add a sort of footnote to it, why the Manichaeanism? There are morally freighty, weighty, morally serious arguments here about justice in the governing, the self-governing of a free people, and there can be a tendency to think that I've read enough and I've thought enough, but this is the morally right, just answer. If Jane disagrees with me, she must have bad motives. She must be a bad person. She's some kind of sophist. And the first thing I would do is I would not share a stage with her, because that's giving credit to somebody who's
platforming.
I'm platforming, right? So there is that tendency to think, how could it happen that the authors of the Declaration of Independence can say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, but then they're calling for a form of government that's complex and complicated, and they're giving reasoned arguments. I mean, the invocations to the deity in the Declaration of Independence refer to God as a lawmaker and a judge and an executive, right? There's this idea of separation of roles and power. So how can you believe in truths of the justice of natural rights for all human beings and then accept there's confusion? There's a need for argument and deliberation, and that other point of view, they might just possibly be right. So to hold those two in tension it's not natural. That's why it takes this kind of education.
Practice.
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Carrese, you've written a book that starts with the phrase democracy and moderation. Could you unpack that concept of moderation just a little bit as it regards civic education?
I didn't know about this.
Yes, so it's a book, also scintillating reading. I mean, especially if you have an insomnia problem. Democracy and moderation. The idea comes from the Greek sense of virtues, that one of the virtues regarding choices we make is to be aware of temptations or tendencies to go too far with a good thing. You know, as a married man, I can say, sex is a good thing, right? Food, drink, good thing. Wine, I'm Italian, good thing, right? Too much of it, right? Political power and authority, good thing. Too much of it, imbalanced, going too far ends up being a bad thing. You can all think of examples of this in your life, from daily life, but to or organizationally and politically. So the separation of powers principle itself is a moderating principle to capture the good of each of these areas or elements of political life. By separating them out, you'll be a better judge if you're only a lawyer and a judge, rather than if you're trying to be, Solomon and do all the roles. You need that thing, but you don't want that thing or that element to go too far, is the principle. So it's not a mediocrity argument for moderation. It's an excellence argument. And then with competing ideas and say philosophical principles, to find the reasonable middle ground is to find a higher ground. It's not settling lower for that. So the philosopher Montesquieu is very widely read by the framers when thinking about a form of government for the Union, but even for the state constitutions. He's the primary author of our idea of separation, distribution of powers, 3 powers. The legislative power should be separate from the executive power, should be separate from the judicial. He said in his book, The Spirit of Laws, in 1748, the main reason that I wrote this book was to get across the point that the spirit of good laws and good government is the spirit of moderation. Just as in morals and ethics, so in politics, the most just and reasonable position will be found in the middle. We'll avoid extremes. So that's partly an answer to your Manichaeanism, right? To be self-aware that I think I've got the just and the right answer, but I have to be aware that I might be going a little bit too far and be in a bubble and be a bit too narrow. So that's the moderation principle. Thank you.
Can I ride one hobby horse in closing? I was just thinking about your question about 2 parties and your question about the now. I think we should all be fighting for national service at whatever levers of government and civic participation, right? Like the answer to so many of these questions is about finding people who are not like you to have honest discussions with. And the place where this has always happened in the United States is in military service, right. Especially after Truman integrated the military in 1947. That went away with the end of the draft, and I think no reasonable person would successfully argue for reinstating the draft now. But a sort of amorphous form of national service where you could teach, where you could do infrastructure work, where you could serve in the military. We can all make a commitment here. You've come to this offering on a Friday afternoon. You're all people who are civic minded or under Professor Gross's compulsion, one or the other. So you're people who are poised to seek out difference in your life and try to navigate across it. Not everybody is. We need ways to put the American population in a blender and disrupt that zip code. And I think national service, if I could wave a wand over one thing, it would be that. 18 months, 2 years. No college professor will bemoan people being older when they get to your classroom.
Right, right.
Well, please join me in thanking Paul and Jane for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, great fun. Thank you.
Thank you,
With your
Ben.
last words.
I know. It's been a pleasure to celebrate Constitution Day with you. It's been a pleasure to engage in the spirit of civic friendship and reflective partisan identity, but also reflective in American identity. I want to thank the Jack Miller Center. I want to thank Alabama Humanities Alliance. I want to thank the American Democracy Project at JSU for sponsoring this event today. I want to thank Emma and Jeff, who offered a professional development session earlier today for our students. I want to thank Civics and Arizona State for sending them out. And I invite you to join us again here on October 3rd for the Free Speech Forum hosted by the American Democracy Project, and to join us for the next Tocqueville lecture on October 19th when we will look at the crisis presidency. If you can stick around and fill out a survey, we would appreciate it. And we hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again for joining us. Bye.